Namaste and welcome to my channel. My name is Rohil and today I'm going to be speaking about the Gurukul system of education in ancient India, one of the most successful systems of education worldwide. And so I'm going to talk initially about how this education system was formed, what were the principles and structure upon which it was based, how it evolved in time, and how the Mughal Empire, which came from the Middle East and Mongolia, how they kind of weakened the Gurukul system of education, and how the British finally struck a death blow to the Gurukul system of education. So this video is going to go through a 2000 year period, 2000, yeah, about 2000 years, a little bit more than 2000 years. So we would have to begin in 500 BC, 2500 years ago. So as a backdrop to the Gurukul system of education, there was the collapse of the Indus Valley Civilization. So the Indus Valley Civilization existed in what is present day Pakistan. There was an ancient river, the Sindhu River, which was flowing from the Himalayas into present day Pakistan. And one of the most ancient civilizations, the Indus Valley Civilization, was there living on the banks of this river. About 2500 years ago, in 500 BC, this Indus Valley civilization collapsed because of tectonic shifts in the Himalayan mountains. So, the Himalayan mountains, as many of you might know, are a relatively new mountain range in terms of geological time scales. It's only 60 million years old, one of the youngest mountains on the planet. And the Himalayas are a fold mountain. So there's this Indian tectonic plate that is hitting against the Tibetan tectonic plate and creating a fold mountain. So the Himalayas have a lot of earthquakes and tectonic shifts every few thousand years. And about 2500 years ago was a time where there were a lot of tectonic shifts up in the Himalayas. So this caused the Sindhu River, which was flowing through present day Pakistan, to dry up. The Sindhu River started to dry up, and instead the water or the glacier water was being rerouted to what we would call today the Ganges or the Ganga River. So the Ganga, which now flows, has its initiation point or its source at the Gangotri glacier, and similarly the Sindhu River also had its source at the same glacier, but due to tectonic shifts, the river starts to flow now in the northern belt of India. So this caused the collapse of the Indus Valley civilization and the shift or migration of a lot of people into northern India. So during this time, there was also a lot of different kingdoms that developed across India. So there were kingdoms in the south of India, there were kingdoms in the north of India, and this entire landmass was called at the time Bharat. So there was a great epic called Mahabharat or Great Bharat. So Bharat can be seen as the indigenous name of India. India is the name that the British gave to Indians, and before that there was Hindustan, which was the name the Muslims gave to the Indians, but Bharat was the indigenous name of the people who lived in the Indian subcontinent. So Bharat wasn't like an empire. We think of Bharat today as a some might think of it as a big kingdom, a big empire with one ruler, similar to the Greek Empire or the Persian Empire or the Ottoman or the Roman Empire. But Bharat was not an empire. There were many different kingdoms within this landmass. This landmass stretched all the way from present day Afghanistan, all of India, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Tibet, and large parts of Southeast Asia, Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, and so on. So this entire landmass could be called Bharat. And why was it called Bharat? Was because there were a lot of cultural similarities in all of these places. And in all of these places, the practices of yoga, of meditation were quite widespread. So 2500 years ago was also coincidentally the golden age of yoga. So that was the period where yoga really started to flourish in ancient India. It was also the time when the Gurukul system of education was established in ancient India. What is unique about this education system is that it was established by the yogis or the spiritual leaders of ancient India. So, like I said, there were many different kingdoms in different parts of India, all of them quite culturally similar. And many of the kings in their courts and in their kingdom wanted to have a yogi or a spiritual saint to be an advisor to them. This transition where kings suddenly wanted to have advisors who were yogis and people of a spiritual bent around them was actually a few texts that came out also in that 500 BC period. So there was the text of the Bhagavad Gita, very important text, which is essentially teaching us how to practice yoga in our day to day experience or our day to day life. Before this, during the Indus Valley Civilization, there was the priestly class, so there was the kind of Hinduism as a religion, and there were the yogis who were separate. So yoga wasn't so widely practiced in the households, in each and every individual household. Yoga was more so practiced away in the mountains and the forests. So the yogis had to leave or renounce their life to go in search of that spiritual truth. So, in this way, the yoga community was divorced from the general day to day economic activities and other religious community. Around 500 BC, this started to change when the Bhagavad Gita was written, the Yoga Sutras were written. It was also the time where Patanjali was alive, where the Buddha was alive. All of these beings managed to spread yoga and meditation far and wide throughout the Indian subcontinent, throughout Bharat. And thus, it was a transition period where yoga, being a practice only done by yogis away, far away from civilization and society, to now yoga being done in each and every household in all the towns and villages. And the Gurukul system of education was very important in bringing yoga from the mountain tops, from the forests, and into each and every household. So at this time, because of these various texts that were written, of course, not the whole population couldn't read in Sanskrit, so they couldn't really read the Bhagavad Gita or the Yoga Sutras or other texts that were written during this period. However, it was the royal class that were reading these texts. So the kings, rich people in the court, big businessmen of that time, and so on, who were starting to read these texts. So they were starting to read the Bhagavad Gita, the Yoga Sutras, which were texts written by yogis, and it started to change their way of thinking. It brought into their life a more spiritual element. They themselves became interested in the practice of yoga. They started to practice yoga and meditation, and now they also needed to make many decisions on a daily basis, very difficult decisions. Generally, when you're in a position of power, you have responsibility over a large number of people. Many decisions come up that are very hard. They require you to take a decision one way or the other, and sometimes it's very difficult to deal with the repercussions that one feels emotionally and spiritually. How to make the best decision for the kingdom as a whole, even though it might hurt some people. And so these kings uh, had yogis as consultants, you can say, the modern day consultants. So they were kind of, they looked far and wide for these masters, enlightened masters, to come and join their court and give them some wisdom about how to rule, how to deal with bandits who are coming from other places, how to deal with problems within the kingdom, and so on. So for any kind of spiritual advice, they went to these yogis. So soon, in the next couple of centuries, these yogis proliferated, which means that they spread to all the different kingdoms in the Indian subcontinent. And so now at this point, the yogis started to realize that they have a lot of power, that they have been bestowed with a lot of power. They have direct access to royalty, direct access to the rulers, the leaders, the kings and queens. And so the yogis, many different lineages of yogis. So a lineage is basically from teacher to student, teacher to student. So it's kind of like a tradition, a lineage of teachings. So you have different branches of yoga, different branches of teachings, and many lineages started to think that, okay, now maybe now is the time where we should, not only are we talking about becoming spiritually enlightened and from the individual perspective, but we should create a society that enables that. So let's sit together and create a society, a well functioning society, where the maximum number of people can practice yoga, can practice meditation, can bring all of these spiritual practices into their daily living without the need of renouncing or leaving life. And so, thus, the formation of the Gurukul system of education began. So, each of these different kingdoms, many different kingdoms around 500 BC, started to, you can say, institutionalize or say that every village should have a Gurukul. So now each and every village were required to have a small mutt. At that time, it was called a mutt. In more modern language, we would call it an ashram or a yoga school. So this was a place usually at that time under a big tree, maybe a big banyan tree or a peepal tree. So under a big tree, there would be some space where which would be covered. So it would be covered so that when it rains, somebody can lie down or sit down underneath it and not get wet. And underneath there would be a small wooden bed made out of wood where somebody could rest on. So this was the setup, just a small cover, a small wooden bed, a small place nearby where one could, a small pit to make a fire so that one could cook one's own food. So this had to be kind of sponsored by every village, had to make this kind of a setup. And yogis would then be able to travel from village to village teaching their different practices. And as they travel from village to village, they would be given food, maybe some grains, some fruits, some vegetables, whatever was growing in that village would be given to them. They had the fireplace, they could cook their own food, and they had shelter under which they could sleep. So another interesting thing that I would have to bring in here so that we can understand exactly how the Gurukul system was functioning is the traditions of the yogis itself. So as I mentioned, in the Indus Valley Civilization and before, in those periods of time, of course, these yogis were far away from the Indus Valley Civilization. Many of them were deep in the Himalayas, in the cave networks, and so on. During this time, in many different lineages and traditions, there was the concept of Guru Dakshina. So even today, we have this concept of Guru Dakshina, a guru meaning a master or a teacher, we would say in our modern day language, but essentially the word guru means a dispeller of ignorance, somebody who is dispelling ignorance, not through healing somebody directly, but through showing the path, through showing the way towards self realization. So a guru dakshina means donation. So essentially, if one wanted to become a yogi 3000 or 4000 years ago, one wanted to leave their life in the town, they wanted to not get married, not pursue any business or any other career, and simply devote themselves to spiritual practice. Maybe they would go to the forests or the Himalayas, the mountains, in search of a yogi. If the guru took them or accepted them, saw that they were fit for the role, they would then spend a long period of time studying with their guru, maybe 3 years, 6 years, 12 years, different periods of time studying with their guru. Of course, this was completely free. The guru did not expect the student to pay anything in terms of whether it was food or it was clothes or spices. The student didn't have to usually give anything to the guru. It was a completely free system of education. So now this was happening in the Indus Valley Civilization. And after that 12-year period, there was something known as a Guru Dakshina. So now you have, as a student, you have matured, you are able to practice, do these practices well. And so the Guru would initiate the student, and the student would then, as a thanks for those many years where the Guru has not only taken care of the student's spiritual needs, but also the physical, material needs, now the student gives back some kind of donation to the guru. And this in the past would involve maybe some clothes, some spices, some kinds of foods would be given to the guru. So this was how Guru Dakshina was done about 3000 years ago. Now fast forward to the beginning of the Gurukul system of education, and now many lineages decided at this time that it's it's no longer so important that the guru itself gets the donation. Maybe it should be that not only the guru gets the donation, but actually the whole lineage or the whole tradition of teachers that came before should actually be getting this donation. Why should just one individual take all this silks and wealth, and especially when they're renunciates and they are trying to leave behind all their material possessions? And so at that time, many lineages changed it and said that, okay, we will not do the Guru Dakshina only to the Guru, but the Dakshina, the donation, will be to the entire lineage, to the entire tradition. And in many lineages, this Dakshina became to actually spread these teachings, to take these teachings from village to village, from town to town for a period of years. So some lineages had it for 6 years, for instance, some for 3 years, some for 5, some for 10. So it depending on each particular lineage, a student, once they had practiced with their guru for a long period of time, then as a way of repaying their guru, had to go around and share what they had learned, share these teachings with a larger population, moving from village to village, town to town, sharing these teachings. And so now these individuals went on to share their teachings. Generally, there were certain rules in how they had to share. So one rule was that a saint, because they are saints, they are renunciates, they have given up their life, a saint should not get stuck to any one particular place. This is very dangerous. So as a saint is traveling from village to village, suddenly he or she may come across a village which is really beautiful. There is a lot of abundance in the village, amazing fruits, the weather is really nice, the people look beautiful, warm, welcoming. And now the saint decides, okay, this looks like a really great place, so I'm just going to stay put here. I'm just going to sit here and enjoy what life has to offer me in this place. However, for the saint, this is really dangerous, because if the saint sits there for a period of a year, maybe falls in love, and so on, and soon forgets his sainthood and gets reintegrated back into society, starts doing business, tries to earn a living, and loses his or her spiritual practice. So it was important to keep the integrity of the spiritual practice, that they remained renunciates or only focused on those spiritual practices. So one of the rules was that they couldn't stay in one place for maybe 2 nights or 3 nights. Again, this depended based on the lineage. So they had to keep moving from town to town, village to village every 2 or 3 days. The second rule in many lineages was that they had to move around with a begging bowl, which meant that they were not allowed to earn their money, their living, because if they started to earn money and be responsible for their own food, for instance, this would again create the issue where once you start earning, maybe little bit is not enough, I need more. And okay, I'm anyways earning this money, this is my hard earned money, why not, why only buy food with it, maybe I can buy something else. And also this is another way where a yogi could have got reintegrated back into society. So they were not allowed to stay in one place for too long, they were not allowed to earn money, so that meant they had to move around with a begging bowl. At the same time, as I said, many of the yogis were counsel or consultants to the kings, and so they were setting up the Gurukul system, the ashrams in each and every village, so that now the yogis could travel from village to village, um, essentially without having to think about where they're going to get their next meal, because they know in the next village there'll be a space for them to lie down with shelter in case it's raining. There will be a space for them to set up a fire, there'll be wood waiting for them, and some grain and fruit and vegetables and so on waiting for them to eat, so they're not going to go hungry. And in return for that village hosting them and giving them food and so on, they would now have to teach the people in the village something of what they knew. So some yogis might have learned a lot about meditation, others a lot about certain pranayama or breathing techniques, others would teach maybe some asanas, maybe some were well aware of different herbal remedies of Ayurveda. They were kind of healers or doctors, and they would help patients in the village. So each person that passed through would have some unique, based on what they had learned, which lineage they were from. They had something unique to share with that village, with that town, and they would then go about to share and teach. So similar to a modern day master class or modern day workshop, where for 2 or 3 days they would be teaching, not only the youth, the young boys and girls, but also the elderly could come and learn from them. Uh, Apart from the yogis traveling from village to village, each village also had a local teacher who would teach things like metallurgy or agriculture or smelting, all the subjects that were taught 2000, 2500 years ago. So this was how the Gurukul system of education was established. Now, fast forward about 1500 years later, in 1000 CE, so this was 1000 AD, about just 1000 years ago. So 1500 years after the Gurukul system was first established, in 1500 years, this system spread massively. At its height in 1000 AD, there were about 800,000 Gurukuls in the Indian subcontinent. 800,000 Gurukuls. It is estimated that there was one Gurukul per every 50 or 60 individuals. So some villages, some bigger villages or towns had multiple Gurukuls even. And this was an extremely successful system of education. It was completely free. And through the Gurukul system of education, yoga, meditation, all of these practices spread into each and every household almost of ancient India. Almost each and every household was using Ayurvedic principles in their cooking. And today, if you go back to India and you meet the grandparent generation, they still have those understandings of Ayurveda, even though they didn't really learn it from school or anywhere like that. It was just passed down to them from their parents and grandparents and so on. And so these traditions remained in the families. But when this was really instituted into each and every household was during this period from 500 BC to 1000 AD. This 1500 years marks the classical period of yoga history, and this marks a period, a golden age of yoga, of Ayurveda in ancient India, where yoga and Ayurveda spread to almost each and every household through the Gurukul system of education. So I have studied a few different places around the world, and nowhere has such a system of education been instituted at a large population scale. So this has been done at smaller scales in ancient Egypt, in smaller scales in ancient in South America, in the Aztec civilizations, and so on. But nowhere has it been done at such a large scale, where 800,000 schools were a part of that system. Of course, like everything that is good in the world, it cannot last forever. Things are always changing. What goes up will come down, what is down will go up. And so, around 1000 CE, about 1000 years ago, was the beginning, the downfall of the ancient Indian civilization at that time. So, we had one major high, you can say, or blossoming of the civilization during the Indus Valley period, and a second blossoming again during the this period when the Gurukul system spread. Also, there was a lot of economic activity happening at this time. It is estimated that about 1000 years ago, at the peak of the classical period of yoga history, India accounted for over 30% of global trade or global domestic product (GDP). And this, of course, led many others surrounding civilizations, surrounding tribes, and so on to become jealous, to want a part of this wealth. And this led to the Mongol raids. So we had Genghis Khan from the Mongols, so from Central Asia. They started to come on horsebacks. They had much superior horses, superior swords, and so on. And of course, it was also a period 1000 years ago where many different kingdoms in ancient India were fighting against each other, were battling each other, and this made them weak to kind of defend themselves against this onslaught of raiding. There was also the raids coming in from the Middle East. The Arab horse riders were also coming in, And basically these two populations were coming in the middle of the night with about 1,000 or 2,000 horsemen. They were breaking the city walls, entering the city, killing whoever they saw, going to the temple. And the temple at that time in ancient India was a place where the wealth was stored. So there was a lot of gold, a lot of riches stored in the temples. So they were going into the temple, stealing the riches and running away. Of course, if they could, they would also take a few women with them and run away. So this was also a transition time in the Indian history, where before this period, in ancient India, women and men were not so repressed sexually. The society was less sexually repressed. It was much more open, and you can see this through various cave paintings from that period. You can see this through art in the various temples uh, through that period. Also, the literature, we have many texts which spoke about sexual, how to create sexual freedom, and so on. Of course, this started to change 1,000 years ago as we had the first raiders. It was no longer safe for women to be outdoors in the night, in the evening, and so slowly, women's freedom was taken away, and the society, as the Mongols and the raiders from the Middle East came in more in larger and larger numbers, it also started to affect the culture in ancient India. So what happened a few centuries later was the Mongols and the Mughals from the Middle East had an intermarriage. So they married into each other, and they decided to come with a much stronger force and live in India itself. So they came with a much stronger force. They colonized certain parts of ancient India, and they decided to live there itself. Now, of course, this was very detrimental to the Gurukul system of education, because now there were kings and rulers who didn't really have uh, yogis as advisors. They were not spiritual themselves. They were not practicing yoga or meditation. They didn't really care about these practices. So many libraries were burnt down. Many Ayurvedic or Siddha medicine libraries were burnt down during this period. In the larger cities, the larger towns, many of the gurukuls were broken down and mosques were erected in their spot. So there was a lot of change that was happening on the ground. Of course, the Gurukul system still survived. It was not its like its former glory of one Gurukul per 50 or 60 people. That, of course, that ratio subsided. Many Gurukuls in the bigger towns were destroyed, but in many of the smaller towns, in the villages, many of the Gurukuls still remained intact. The yogis were still traveling from one Gurukul to the next, and the system was still alive, though it was corrupted. It was not the same as its former self. It was still surviving. We then had the Mughal Empire, which then took over almost the entire ancient India landmass. Um, Following that, of course, we had the comings of the British. So the British East India Company first arrived to Calcutta, and the British East India Company was essentially the first or the second corporation in the world, and they were coming for trade. Um, they wanted to trade with India, because still, even when the British came around the 1500s and 1600s, India at that time, even though it had lost a lot of its economic wealth during the Mughal rule, it was still quite wealthy. It accounted for 26-27% of world GDP, down from about 34-35%, but still quite wealthy. So the British wanted that in their trade route. They wanted to trade in spices, silks, and cottons, and so on. And so the British East India Company also realized that there was a lot of problems in the society. Of course, the earlier kingdoms were fighting against the Mughals, so there was a lot of animosity between the local indigenous kings and the outsiders that had come in. So they played that card, kind of pitting one kingdom against the other, fighting, making fights. And this disunity, the British East India Company used to slowly take over the entire Indian landmass. Now, of course, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the British Crown got involved and the British Army got involved, and they slowly transitioned to taking over the Indian landmass from the British East India Company. So this was a time where there was a general called Lord Macaulay. He was a governor general in India in the early 1800s, and he was in charge of the education system in India. So he was a politician, and had history in education in the West, in Britain, and he wanted to create an education system for India. Lord Macaulay, in a letter that he wrote to the British Crown after spending a few years in India, said that the Gurukul system of education is highly dangerous. He said that this system of education is very dangerous because there are yogis moving from town to town. These yogis are well respected by the population, and any one of them that has a good oratorial capacity and ability to speak well, to influence others through their speech, could create a kind of revolution because they are traveling from town to town. It's a very dangerous system of education. And so, if the British has to control the Indian landmass and control any revolution that may come up, the Gurukul system of education should is the first thing that should be eliminated. And so Lord Macaulay, with the help of the British Crown, passed the Indian Education Act in 1835. In 1835, they passed the Indian Education Act, which basically made the Gurukul system of education illegal. It was no longer allowed for the yogis to teach these practices in any small town or village. If they were found doing so, many of them were arrested, many of them were harassed, beaten up, tortured, and so on. And of course, on the face of it, in the education policy, this wasn't written, but what was written was that we are modernizing the education system in India. We are bringing the British system of education to India, industrial education, so that people are ready for an industrial revolution, for the jobs that will be created by an industrial revolution. So this is what happened during the British period. So now, with the Gurukul system of education completely collapsing, overnight the yogis had to flee and run to the back to the mountains, back to the forests, and once again, after a period of 2,500 years, or maybe 2,000, between 2,000 to 2,500 years, for the first time again, yoga had to retreat back to the mountain tops and back to the forests, away from each and every household. Of course, many of the yogis were quite worried about this because they were worried that soon yoga would be lost in India. These traditions, these philosophies, these ways of thinking would be replaced by the British, the Western ways of thinking, through the Western education system. The yogis also were worried because the yogis in the mountains were renunciates. They could not breed. They had renounced their life. So the next generation of yogis necessarily had to come from the towns and the villages and the cities across the Indian subcontinent. And now their access to those towns and villages was cut out by the British. And so it was difficult for them to have the next generation. If a boy born in the village never has access or sees a yogi in their lifetime, it is difficult for this boy or this girl to think about taking up a lifestyle of a yogi. So this was a period of a lot of concern for the yogis at the time. Many different lineages actually got together at that time, and I would say that the collapse or the death of the Gurukul system of education, by far the most successful system of education anywhere in the world, the death of this Gurukul system of education actually led to the birth of modern yoga as we see it today. Many different lineages started to get together, and they realized that the only way to keep these traditions of yoga, of meditation alive was to take it to the West. So many of them started to train their yogis to move to the West. So we had influential individuals like Swami Vivekananda, Paramahansa Yogananda, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, amongst many, many others. I would keep taking names, so I'm not going to take all the names of yogis that went in the late 1800s and early 1900s, especially to the US. Many of them found themselves in California, in the US. They thought that the US was more progressive, Christianity had lesser of a foothold in the US, and so they would be more welcomed and accepted in the US. So many of them were trained not only in the yogic practices, in the yogic traditions, but they also had to go through the British system of education so that they understood the British etiquettes, so that they understood, they could speak English well. So all of them were very fluent in English. When even Vivekananda, who was the first Indian yogi to go to the US, and he spoke at the Conference for World Religions, he was already a very good speaker in English, very oratorial, which is why he created such ripples with his first speech. Was even invited to the White House in the late 1800s and so on. So we saw this wave of yogis going in the late 1800s, early 1900s, especially to the US. And this first contact of the West with yoga actually brought a lot of interest in yoga, in these spiritual practices, in these spiritual traditions, and it put yoga on the kind of the travel map for the US in the 1900s. So especially when we had the beginnings of the hippie movement in the 1960s, India was one of the major places where a lot of people who were looking for some kind of spiritual practice, were looking to understand a deeper meaning, a deeper purpose in their life, would travel to India to meet with yogis and teachers. And this put India on the map for these kind of spiritual practices. And thus in the 1960s, a lot of people came to India, which brought yoga in a big way to the US in the late 1900s, and from there it started to spread to Europe and other parts of the world. Today we see an explosion of yoga all around the world, and this explosion was birthed in the mid 1800s with the death of the Gurukul system of education. The yogis thought the only way to keep yoga and these traditions alive was to take them to the West. So from this perspective, we can see that it's been almost 1,000 years where India has been through a kind of dark period where yoga has faltered, the traditions and the culture have been subjugated to many invasions from the outside. And it is now for the first time that India is slowly starting to free itself up from that kind of oppression, cultural oppression, oppression of thinking, and so on. So, like everything in this world, everything goes through cycles. A civilization that goes up must necessarily come down. A civilization that comes down must at some point begin to rise again. So thank you so much for listening to this video. I know it was a long chat, but I tried to, as briefly as possible, take you through a 2000-year history of the Gurukul system of education in ancient India. I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me in the comment section. If you have any ideas or recommendations for videos that I can make in the future, I would love to hear from you. Do subscribe, like my video, and share it with others to help me get this content to more and more people. Thank you so much once again for tuning in. Have a nice day. Namaste.